This footage shows the last time Julia Rawson was ever seen alive. I think it's important to start today's story with a fact about Julia. Growing up, I always looked at people who worked as artists, doing what they loved for a living, as really having made it in life. Julia Rawson was one of those people who really lived her dream. She was not only an artist, but she also had this amazing ability to connect with people. Her friends said that she could literally walk up to any person in any bar and start a conversation. Usually, this meant that she would have a great night out, and then she would wake up in the morning and have 10 people's phone numbers in her phone, 10 new friends. But on the fateful evening of the 11th of May 2019, she made friends with a devious and dangerous person. And this person would end Julia's life in the most brutal way. This is REDRUM, stories about the true victims of crime. I use news archives, documentary footage and books to research these cases, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes in a podcast or YouTube form in the description down below. You can get ad-free early releases on Patreon, where you can support REDRUM to keep happening from just a couple of quid each month. Thank you. Julia Rawson was born in Stafford in the West Midlands of England. She was 42 years old in 2019, but she had this childlike persona, and it helped hugely with how she made her art. She had always been a keen artist, and she'd been doing art since she was young. She'd even gone on to study it at college, and while she was there, she began dating a woman called Elaine. The two hit it off, and it really wasn't long before they were spending more and more time, pretty much all of their time together. So much so that they ended up moving in together as well. For a while, they were renting this small flat, still in Stafford itself, and life really was dreamy for the two of them. But they soon decided that after a little while of living there, they wanted to upsize. They wanted somewhere a little bit bigger, and also somewhere that was nearby a market so that they could open up an art stall and sell their art from there. And so once they'd settled into their new home, they did open an art stall together, and there they sold pieces of their art alongside other creative bits and bobs like candles and jewellery. Whilst they were there, they made a ton of new friends, and Julia really was seen as the life and soul of the party. She was a true artist, literally making art as her job, but also she lived life through this kind of child's gaze, as her friends would describe it. She never wanted to grow up, and she knew that now she built this life around her where she got to do what she loved every single day. She made enough money to pay the bills. There was nothing else she felt she needed in her life other than to enjoy it and have a good time. Her friend Debbie from college spoke about how often Julia used to make them do things just because she got so excited by them. Her energy was infectious. Julia knew how much Elaine loved the band The Strokes, and so she ended up buying tickets to surprise her with. The show was fast approaching, just 2 weeks after May the 11th, 2019, which was the date when Julia decided to go out to a local bar for a few drinks. Elaine was waiting at home for Julia to return that evening after having been hanging out with her friends, but Julia never showed up. This wasn't initially a huge concern for Elaine because she knew how popular Julia was. She knew she had a number of friends that she would hang out with, and it wasn't unusual for her to get so wrapped up in the evening that she'd end up staying over at one of their houses. However, by the end of the following day, and with no signs from Julia and no word from her, Elaine began to think that something might be wrong. She waited another day, this time calling around friends' houses, attempting to find out where Julia may have gotten to if she'd gone off elsewhere, but she had no luck. And so that is when she decided to pick up the phone and call the police. They took a missing persons report and they began to do an investigation of their own, starting with finding out who had last seen Julia and exactly where she'd been. The investigating team managed to find some CCTV footage of Julia on the 11th of May. She'd been in the Bottle and Cork. I'll be honest, I did try and have a little bit of a look for this pub and try and find out a bit more about it so I could tell you all about it, but it was pretty hard to find. I did find some pictures. I'll show them here. To be honest, it looks pretty grim. It's almost as if it's abandoned, but I don't think it is, at least not at the end of last year, 2023, when this photo was taken. Either way, it does not look massively inviting. But the CCTV footage did show that Julia definitely spent a chunk of the evening in this pub. And the footage shows her walking around up to different people. Clearly she's incredibly social, she's incredibly chatty. Some of them she may have known, that's clear from bits of the footage. And then there are other people who it's clear they probably were strangers and she was just talking, having a chat, probably wanting to get to know them a little bit before moving on to the next person. And then CCTV tracks Julia walking across to the other side of the bar where she strikes up a conversation with a man. The pair began talking, and then the man rolls up one of his jacket sleeves, and he shows her a number of his tattoos. Julia then sits next to him and the pair continue talking, and they talk for a long time. There's no sound on the CCTV footage, but it's clear from the body language that they present and the length of time that they stay chatting for. They're clearly very deep in conversation. And then someone from behind the bar calls that it's last orders, and so they finish up their drinks and they end up leaving through the same door at around 1 a.m. This was the police's first real lead, and they managed to identify the man on the screen pretty much straight away, because in the footage, as we know, he reveals his tattoos and they are quite distinctive. The footage was taken and stills were made, and that's when they were circulated to a number of local people. And it wasn't long before one of them called in to say that they'd seen someone right now in Dudley Town Centre matching the description. He appeared to have the same tattoos as the man in question. Police managed to track Nathan Maynard Ellis down. He lived just around the corner on Mission Drive in Dudley, and he lived there with his boyfriend David Leasley. Although Nathan initially denied that it was him in the footage, police had no doubt it was obviously him, and so they just arrested him right there and then. And as he was with his boyfriend, they thought he may know something.
What's the name of her?
Julia Rawson.
Who?
Julia.
Julia? Julia Wilson?
Rawson.
Rawson? Rawson?
Do you know anyone by that name?
The only women I know is my family or his family, I know. Right. This is my partner.
Yeah.
Who's...
You guys details?
No, I'm going to get him. Oh, no, get him details.
What's your name, please?
I'm not going to give details, I know. Because you're very similar to the person that was
No,
there.
but just for looking like someone, I don't really want to...
No, I know, but we were also...
At first, David spoke about how it just couldn't have been Nathan in the CCTV footage because he was with him at home. Even though, and I have to say this, it is blindingly obvious that it is him, David assured officers that Nathan had been with him all night. He couldn't have left, he couldn't have come back. There was just no way it was him. But presented with that CCTV footage and the fact it was crystal clear he wasn't going anywhere, David began to change his story slightly. He insisted that Nathan was with him at home for some of the time that evening, but he may have gone out on the night Julia disappeared after all. He added, however, that even if he did go out, he knew for a fact that Nathan would never do anything to Julia. He would never hurt another soul. He just wasn't like that. And although with this information they thought David might be beginning to crack, he actually then sort of stopped talking. He didn't reveal anything else throughout those first few hours of questioning. And so with David and Nathan not talking, police had to turn their focus solely to the physical evidence that they'd already found. Now, as both men were in custody, police managed to gain entry to their flat and they got a warrant to search this flat. And when they went in, they realised pretty much straight away that this was no ordinary home. The walls were laced with posters of serial killers, of horror movies, and there were books about true crime, and there were weapons pinned all across the walls. Now look, I am obviously interested in true crime. I have loads of true crime physical books, lots on my laptop. My Google search history is just full of crime, and I also love horror films. There's nothing wrong with having an interest in any of these things, obviously, and hello, welcome, hi. I'm sure that you are also the same, seeing as you're here. Some of the people who watch REDRUM don't like horror films, but they do like podcasts. They might not watch a horror film in their life, but they might binge 12 episodes of Forensic Files. We all have different interests, even in this quite niche genre of true crime. Most of my friends in the real world do not like to engage with true crime, but they don't think I'm weird for finding it interesting. They know it's because of, well, a whole host of reasons, whatever that might be for you. It's probably different for me. It might be for me that I want to know how to protect myself, or that I'm trying to get to know the victims, the real people behind these headlines. Whatever it is, for any of us, it's never ever done in a way that glorifies or looks up to these people who have done these horrific things. But for Nathan and David, their flat was the complete opposite of that. There were dolls' heads placed carefully around different areas of the home, as if they were decorations, as if they were like prized possessions. And the weapons were real. There were knives and axes that could genuinely be used to hurt someone. The investigating team made their way further inside, and that's when they came across this large chunk of carpet that looked very different to the rest of the carpet on the floor. It seemed to have been ripped up, or at least part of it had been ripped up and then replaced with a different kind of carpet. The officers also noticed a pretty awful smell, and they'd noticed that pretty much as soon as they'd entered the flat, and it got worse as they got further into the flat itself. Those officers called in for extra reinforcement, and the carpet itself was pulled up, and when they looked underneath, they found this underlay that had lots of deep red stains on it. This underlay had very clearly not been replaced and had simply been covered up with those new pieces of carpet, and so that underlay was taken in for forensics testing. Alongside this, some of the investigating team were working through the hundreds and hundreds of hours of CCTV footage from the night Julia was last seen, and they also looked at the day afterwards. Now, that day afterwards, in the sort of late hours of the morning, they find Nathan back at that same pub having a drink. And he seems to be completely fine. He's acting completely normal. He sits there, he orders a drink, he even takes a phone call at one point. There is nothing in that footage that is suspicious in any way. Certainly nothing to suggest that he was hiding anything. He wasn't doing anything particularly suspicious. That was until the 16th of May, so 5 days after Julia had gone missing. Nathan's car was tracked on CCTV, and it's tracked passing through the town and eventually arriving at a local waste centre. The footage shows both Nathan and David placing pieces of carpet and a sofa into that waste unit before driving off. They also found more footage of the two men, this time carrying heavy bin bags towards the canal. Officers were immediately sent to the canal and to the waste site to try and retrieve any of these items. They'll come a little later though. In the meantime, other members of the team were sent to that canal area where David and Nathan had been seen with those plastic bags. One of the team found one of those bags quite early on, and the other bag was found pretty soon after. Both of these were brought in for further testing, but it was obvious what was inside. They were full of human remains. And it wasn't long before those human remains were forensically tested and they were found to be a match to Julia. She had been chopped up into 12 separate pieces before being dumped into those bags and into a field next to the canal. With the overwhelming evidence that had just been found, along with all of that CCTV footage that connected the two men to the disposing of Julia's remains, the lead detective went back into the interviewing room to continue questioning David and Nathan. With everything that had been found, it was surely going to be difficult for the two men to continue with their story, saying that they simply had no involvement in Julia's disappearance or murder. But even though it was going to be difficult, or even impossible, you might say, they still continued to say that they were innocent of that crime. They wouldn't give anything up. And so this is what the investigating team believe happened. It's based on forensic evidence found at the scene. It's based on all of that CCTV footage, and it's based on partial confessions. And I use that word very broadly because the confessions that they gave were not accurate or true in any way, but they do give some detail. So this is what investigators believe did happen. On that mild evening in May, Julia had walked up to Nathan and casually started a conversation with him. They spoke about an array of things, including, of course, his tattoos. We saw that on the CCTV. The bar staff then called for last orders, and this is when Julia decided she didn't want to go home quite yet. Nathan invited Julia back to his place, and so they got into a taxi and made the short journey back to his place in Tipton. We don't know exactly what Nathan said to Julia to try and make it seem like it was a good idea to come back to his, but Julia's friends describe her as incredibly trusting, and it probably wouldn't take a huge amount for Nathan to convince her that it was a good idea to come back to his house. Either way, Julia ended up in Nathan's house, and Nathan would later say that once they were back at his place, Julia came on to him. This seems incredibly unlikely because Julia herself was gay. She had a partner who she'd been with for many, many years back at home. So it seems like this is just one of the many lies that Nathan spews over the course of his, quote, confession. Nathan then decided that he was going to use violence to stop her, in his version, of course. In the more widely accepted version, he likely did this just because he wanted to, not because she was hitting on him. And so in this version, the version that investigators think happened, he went into his kitchen, he got a rolling pin from that kitchen, and then he began to beat Julia. And forensics confirmed that Julia had suffered extensive blows to her skull. After that, the exact details of what happened just aren't known. But we do know that Nathan had access to a saw, pliers, a hammer, knives. Any of these he could have used. We know for sure that he did use the saw to dismember Julia after she was dead. And at this point, Nathan did actually admit that he did dismember Julia and that he wrapped each piece of her now dismembered body, the 12 parts, in these bin liners. But this is where his story starts to shift a little. He says that the reason he'd done this, the reason he had dismembered her, was because there were voices in his head telling him to. But this dismemberment was particularly gory. It didn't seem to just be a means to an end. I've covered many cases of REDRUM. If you're a regular watcher, you will know that we do see people dismember bodies all of the time, but usually this is for a practical reason. They need to do it to get rid of the body. And perhaps here it was slightly, but there was very clearly an element of, I don't know what, but something else in this case. Because Julia's kidney had been removed. That kidney had been disposed of with the rest of her body parts, but it had very clearly been taken out of her body for no particular reason and placed inside one of the bags. Both David and Nathan were asked why they removed her kidney, but much like a lot of this case, they just didn't give any answer to that. They just decided to stay silent. The case went to trial, and although Nathan and David both admitted to perverting the course of justice, they actually said that they were not guilty of murder. It was in November of 2020 that Nathan, who was considered to be the leader of this crime, he was said to have had a really large amount of control over the situation and over his partner, David. He was found guilty of murder and he was sentenced to a minimum of 30 years. While David, who was seen as having been controlled by Nathan and was completely infatuated with him, he was also found guilty of murder and he was sentenced to a minimum of 19 years. What also came out of this, at the time, relatively high profile case here in the UK, was that a woman actually came forward to speak to police and said she needed to tell them about her experiences with Nathan. Years earlier, she'd been in a relationship with him and she had been abused by him, said he was extremely controlling and manipulative, and that he was violent. She spoke about how obsessed Nathan was with horror films and that within that, he actually often told her how much he just wanted to kill someone just to see what it was like. When Nathan went out, he would even hide a knife in his jacket or in his back pocket just in case the perfect opportunity arose for him to murder someone. Because of this statement and a number of other things, Nathan was also found guilty of rape and threats to kill. Thanks for joining me for this episode of REDRUM. I also wanted to say, anyone who has gotten in touch since the last episode, and I'll link that down below in case you haven't watched it. It's a really interesting case. They're all interesting, but this one is, it's pretty grim. It's like wrong place, wrong time. Just someone who was out on parole actually at the time of the murder decided to strike again and ended up killing a woman who had no connection to him. I'll link that down below. At the end of that episode, I did ask for people if they had a connection to a crime, to a murder, and they felt like they wanted to talk about it. I asked them to email in because I'm looking at doing a sort of spin-off. REDRUM will continue. There'll still be your one episode a week, but I'm also looking at doing a slight spin-off which will cover a case that is maybe more suited to 5, 6, 7 episodes rather than a 1 episode case. I think the important thing about it is that it's maybe not so well known and that you have a relationship to the case somehow so that I can interview you and talk to you about it. If you missed out on last week's episode, or if you have since thought that you might want to contact me about that, please do. My email address is redrumtruecrimepodcast@gmail.com. I'll put it in the description box down below. Also, you can contact me on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. I'll put all of those in the description box down below as well. Other than that, thank you so much to our patrons who have joined, well, since the beginning really. I haven't done a shout out thank you for a long time. So thank you so much if you are new or old patron. And on the podcast version, I've shouted out your individual names, which I did say I would do, but I haven't said that I'll do it on YouTube. I don't know if people would have a problem with that or not, but for now, I'm just keeping it on the podcast, just in case people don't want their name shared. I don't know if that's silly. Anyway, other than that, thank you so much for your support. Thank you for being here for another week, another episode of Red Rum. And other than that, I will see you next week for another episode. Bye.